Let's take you to London now, where former International Relations and Cooperation Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor is addressing the Global African Conference, focusing on global power hierarchies. Let's listen in.
Welcomed us so warmly this evening. And of course, their excellencies, ambassadors and high commissioners, distinguished academics, and participants to this Africa Week. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I must admit that as Professor Funmi set out all the rules for the discussion later, I got really nervous and I thought, gosh, I'm glad I'm not doing that part of the test. But my warm greetings to all the leadership and staff of the Africa Leadership Center and to all the distinguished participants. I would like to sincerely thank the Center for granting me this wonderful privilege of presenting the opening talk at this year's Africa Week. I look forward later to learning from your contributions in reaction to this talk. When thinking about this evening's talk, I returned to an anthology of poems written and published by Mongani Wale Sirote in 2004. In one of his poems, he asks, "Must I believe that I asked that there was pre-colonial time, there was slave trade, there was colonialism, there was apartheid, and because these were there is racism. Who must I ask in these times of agreement? Who must I ask when it seems there are no witnesses? In this time, when the burden of the past is also mine. With no accomplices, there have been no perpetrators. Who must I ask?" I found this poem relevant for me to the quest that many in the world have been part of in the past, a quest to find out who cares and who acts. In a sense, the question Sirote poses is, what has happened to the global generation of free Nelson Mandela? A generation that established a level of international solidarity that placed such pressure on the apartheid state of South Africa that it had to move to negotiations. I wonder whether such international solidarity is possible in the world Sirote poses questions to. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza and the sustained harm endured by people in these countries, accompanied by totally inadequate global commitment to peace, show very clearly that the global community has to find new, refreshed strategies for entrenching peace and security and for protecting the innocent. For those who might not know what I am referring to, when we were engaged in the struggle against apartheid, when we realized that petition wasn't sufficient to what needed to happen, our leaders traveled all over the globe, engaging world leaders and asking them to join us in our struggle against apartheid, asking them to boycott, to sanction, to take any act that would help advance our cause for freedom. They didn't get positive responses from the governments that they approached, but civil society responded. Sports organizations, creative artists, trade union movements, church organizations, all religious faiths, they said, we will join you in your struggle, and we will boycott, we will sanction, and we will support your struggle for freedom. Through that wonderful initiation of an international solidarity of global dimensions, we were able to exert a great deal of pressure on the apartheid state and get to a point where it became a pariah in the world through global action. Not because of ourselves on our own. Of course, we were active in our country, our masses, our freedom fighters, our liberation organizations, but the aspect of being joined by international solidarity, international action was extremely important. The academic boycotts, the sports boycotts, many of the actions that many of you are probably aware of played such a critical role in helping us to achieve our freedom. Today, those who struggle believe that they are alone, that we no longer have that courage. That's why I'm saying, what happened to the generation of Free Nelson Mandela? The campaign calling for freeing of Nelson Mandela was so powerful that on the occasion of his release from Robben Island, a journalist approached a young boy in Soweto, and he asked him, what is Mandela's first name? And this is not made up, it's real. And the child said, release. Because whenever he heard the name Mandela, he had released Mandela. And so he wasn't aware or familiar with the name Nelson. To him, Mandela was released. And it was that international campaign that made that word so evocative and famous. So I think that we must be worried that we lack the ability to establish similar popular actions in the interest of those who face harm today. We meet at a deeply troubled period in global relations and should be concerned not only at Africa's inadequate progress, but also, and most particularly, about growing threats to universal civil liberties and the practice of democracy. We should worry that instability in Libya has lasted so long, at 4 major coups in Africa, about civil war in Sudan, about the Rohingya and their tragic suffering, and about the peoples of Palestine and Israel trapped in a cruel, never-ending war of existence. The past decade has been witness to these international failings and to a sometimes subtle and often boldly open assault on freedom and democracy. Sadly, as civil society, we seem to have observed this decline in our civil and political liberties, and all of us have proven rather incapable of decisive, effective responses, in a manner suggesting that we believe surely it can't get worse. The worst can't happen. And yet today I think we're seeing that it can get worse. I believe we may now indeed be in the midst of the worst of these assaults on freedom and democracy. And we have to ready ourselves to assert and restore the core values and principles of freedom, democracy, justice, and development. Even more concerning is the growing unashamed assault on academic freedom and on the academy and knowledge generation. This has to be resisted by all of us who support intellectual freedom and the free flow of ideas. The opportunities for success of Africa that I will refer to here require a free flow of ideas and freedom to pursue innovation and new knowledge. If we allow governments to tell universities what they should be doing, knowledge generation and innovation are in trouble. And so we should worry at the intrusion of government into our institutions. Our continent, Africa, continues to be a place riddled with many deeply challenging problems. Some authors describe these challenges in very pejorative prose, such as in a fascinating book, Prisoners of Geography, by Tim Marshall, who ascribes the problems to the inability of Africans to derive value from the strategic assets of their geography, and somewhat neglects, I believe, reference to the influence of imperialism and colonial oppression to Africa's progress. Konege and Mtembu are kinder in their musing on Africa's ability to navigate very complex, constantly shifting geopolitics. They propose in their book several areas of strategic opportunity that Africa could focus upon to evade its constant definition as a continent of failure. Adding to this fresh way of looking at Africa, Adebayo illustrates that in the past 3 decades, there have been periods in which there were visible signs of Africa bravely emerging from dismal growth, inadequate development, and high levels of poverty and inequality. I wonder how many of us remember that in just around 2011 to 2014, we had 13 African countries in the fastest growing economies in the world, and today we're in a very terrible position. The reversals evident leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic and those that persist today indicate our deep-seated problems remain stubborn and difficult to eradicate. These negative attributes exist even in newly democratic and free South Africa, posing a deeply complex intellectual dilemma for the best minds of Africa and its diaspora. In Adebayo's well-crafted essays on Pan-Africanism, he provides a rare intellectual depth that appears to overcome the laziness of Black blaming for inequality and disadvantage. He illustrates the need for sharper intellectual tools if we are to extract effective solutions to Africa's complex problems. He also provides rare insight into the value we could derive from a strengthened, well-executed Pan-African strategy, giving effect to the African Union Charter's affirmation of Africans in Africa working closely with all Africans in the diaspora to jointly pursue the permanent renewal of Africa. Our habit of working as discrete 54 countries has not helped us achieve our goals. This new epoch and era requires a connected, strongly united Africa and its African diaspora. This lack of continued decisive, sustained progress of Africa is a global problem that all the world's leaders should be concerned about. Konege argues in his essay in Mapungubwe's publication on global geopolitics and Africa's position. He argues that in looking solely at problems, we neglect the inherent strategic global attributes that Africa has of abundant ocean, abundant land, and people. And he says these should be the fulcrum of our consideration rather than merely looking at our problems. Perhaps we need to begin with a different set of reflections on Africa, he argues. There are several reasons, I think, for this assertion. You would recall that W.E.B. Du Bois famously asserted in the late 19th century that racism and racial inequality would be the great problems of the 20th century, and implied in a number of essays that the 20th century would be the one in which this weighty problem confronting humanity would be resolved.
All right, live visuals there from the King's College in London, where Dr. Naledi Pandor, former International Relations Minister, is, of course, presenting a talk focusing on global hierarchies at the start of Africa Week. She has touched on the war in the Middle East and the inadequacies of global communities to ensure peace in the world. She's actually asked a very pertinent question of what has happened to the generation that called for the freeing of Nelson Mandela, or phrased differently, where is that caliber of activism to fight today's cause?